Welcome to Power Talks with Santosa. Today we have with us a special guest, Mr. Salil Shetty, the Director of United Nations Millennium Campaign. The goal of the UN Millennium Development Goal is to end poverty by 2015, which is quite an ambitious challenge. Mr. Shetty, at the time when the world is talking about how global economic crisis is going to affect development plans and the manifestation of MDG, we'd like to hear from you something new on this that the world hasn't heard so far.
As far as poor people are concerned, if you take the people who are living in extreme poverty in Nepal, or indeed in most developing countries and poor countries, I think they'll even find it hard to understand what the financial crisis really means, because they are in a perpetual crisis. So if you're living in the US and let's say that instead of having 2 cars, you're going to have to live with only 1 car. But for poor people, who are not sure where their next meal is coming from, their life is a crisis. So I think that's what I always say, because financial crisis, we need to put it in perspective. Whose crisis is it? And there is no doubt that I think if anything, the problem which was caused by some of the richest people in the richest countries is now going to affect, and the consequences of which are going to be felt by some of the poorest people in the poorest countries. So it's another manifestation of global injustice.
So in a way, it doesn't directly affect the poor people, the poor population around the world.
It's early days, and we are starting to see the impacts. But I think particularly in a country like Nepal or Philippines or Bangladesh, for example, where remittances are a very important part of the economy, there is no doubt that it will affect much more directly. But also those countries who are dependent on export incomes, anything which is linked to the Western economies are the ones which are going to be hit most quickly. And the transmission mechanisms of the crisis are diverse. And there's also other issues, like many poor countries are unable to get the sort of credit which they need, this trade credit, those are being squeezed. And although those don't have an immediate and direct impact on the lives of poor people, they have a ripple effect.
If the UN has to eliminate poverty by 2015 or later, will this crisis affect the goal?
We're pretty sure it will affect. What we don't know is exactly and in what shape. If you look at crises like this which have happened in the past, even the 70s, etc., we have found that it actually ends up in a greater number of children dying, and child mortality goes up, kids tend to drop out of school because family incomes are affected. So it has a kind of a myriad effect, a multiplier effect in so many different ways. It's hard to predict exactly what happens, but you've seen the numbers which have come out from, say, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. The number of hungry people has already gone up. Over 1 billion people now are living in hunger. So about 150 million people more are going to be living pushed below the poverty line according to World Bank figures. So we have some numbers, but the details of how it's going to affect are hard to predict.
So how do you envision to deal with this economic deficit or any future financial crisis?
Well, the issue about the Millennium Development Goals and the external financing for the goals, which is likely to be affected, because we are a bit nervous that rich countries, because of their own financial difficulties, will not deliver on their aid commitments for the achievement of the goals. Now, of course, basically we have 2 types of countries. Countries who are serious about these goals, who are serious about their commitments. They have always been serious, they continue to be serious, like the Nordics and the Dutch and the British, some of these are the good guys in a sense. And they have delivered when they had good times. They are delivering, I think they are likely to deliver even during bad times. Now, some of the others were already starting to make noises saying, we can't deliver on the commitments. Frankly, they were not delivering even when they had boom times. So they can't use the financial crisis as an excuse to not keep their commitments, because we have to realize that first of all, none of them are anywhere, the bigger countries, the G8 countries, nobody is close to the 0.7% of gross national income which they had committed many years ago towards overseas development assistance or aid. So that's in the first place. So we're talking about peanuts, like the amount of money we're talking about. If you look at the amount of money that's been given out as bailouts in this financial crisis, I think it's estimated to be in the order of something like $18 trillion or so. And if you add up the entire aid that's been given from rich countries to poor countries over the last 49 years, since aid, in a sense, became something which is accepted as part of the international support process, All of that adds up to, not more than, I think we calculated it to be something like $50 billion, all of that put together. So we're talking about, not 50 billion, I think it was $2 trillion. Yeah, that's right. So it's about the factor of almost 10, between cumulative aid contributions and what has been found for financial bailouts in the space of just 2 years. So we have to put it in perspective. We always say that it's not really a financial issue, it's an issue of political will. If these governments want to support, they can find a way to support it.
When the MDG was incepted in 2000, the leaders of all these developed countries had committed that they will support the alleviation of the poverty. It seems that you're not happy with their promises because they didn't keep it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the promises which have been made the beauty of the Millennium Development Goals is that it is a global compact. So the rich countries committed on Goal 8, which is not just about aid volume, but also aid quality. Because we have big problems on the quality side as well. Because it's not just a matter of how much money they give. It's what kind of conditionalities are attached, how much policy space is available for developing countries, how much of it goes back to their own country. So there are all of those factors. But there's also the debt cancellation, and we've seen some progress, but there's still some way to go. And finally, the trade part of the Goal 8. The trade talks have been deadlocked for a long time now. The Doha round didn't go anywhere. So they have not met their commitments on several counts. And I must say there's some who have, and we have to celebrate and we have to honor them. But there are others who are missing on their commitments. But the Global Compact was not just about the commitment from rich countries. The primary responsibility is with the governments of poor countries, because ultimately the issues of the Millennium Development Goals, which are so basic, meeting the basic needs of people, that is primarily a problem which is being faced by citizens of poor countries. So governments of poor countries have to take primary responsibility, and many of them have not kept their promises either. So it's both sides, are culpable.
So besides lack of fund, are there any other factors or major factors that affects the progress of MDG goals?
No, in fact, in my view, we should not give too much attention on the question of external financing, because that, of course, is important for poor countries. But first and foremost, the question is how much of our own domestic resources we are applying towards the achievement of the goals. And increasingly, the problem is not even about whether we have allocated money in the budget. I know Nepal has had a budget recently, and the money is allocated. The problem in most developing countries is that even after the money is allocated, it doesn't reach the people. So there's a big issue, you call it whatever you want, of governance, of accountability, of corruption, of mismanagement, of inefficiency, so all of those factors. So some countries we don't have the right policy, some places we don't allocate the right resources, but almost in all countries the money doesn't reach the people because of system failures.
Since the initiation of MDG in 2000, how far have you progressed in terms of poverty alleviation?
Well, the latest report from the United Nations Secretary General has just come out, in fact, just 2 weeks ago, which gives the 2009 updated progress. And in fact, I must say, when these goals were signed on, I was not in this job. I used to work for an NGO, and I was one of the people who was a bit skeptical about them. Because, these things, our leaders meet, they make all these promises, every year at the UN there's some conference, and I was very skeptical about it, as I think most people on the street would be. But if you take stock of where we are today, 9 years since the goals were signed, I would say that the progress has been surprisingly good, particularly if you take income poverty. I think there's been quite big progress. Education, 40 million more children are in school. We've saved at least 2 million lives of children under the age of 5. And all of this has happened, because of the concerted focus on these goals and a deadline of 2015 that we have to meet these goals, we have to hit these targets by then. Having said that, there are still many challenges, and there are many countries in the world who are not on track to achieving all the goals. But progress has been quite significant.
We'll continue with our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Power Talks. We're in conversation with Mr. Salil Shetty, the Director of United Nations Millennium Campaign. Mr. Shetty, it's a contentious issue, but we must talk about it. It is heavily debated that foreign aid is counterproductive and it contributes to corruption. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I think, aid, we've had a mixed experience with aid. It ultimately depends on how it's used. I don't think aid in itself can corrupt or is, is insulated against corruption. I think it could go either way. It depends on how you use it. Because, the corruption question is independent of who is funding, because even if it's domestic resources which are being used, if you have a system where there are no clear rules and there's not enough transparency, and there's an ethics deficit in the country, then there's going to be corruption. So I think it's quite independent. But I agree that there is one issue in relation to aid which creates a bit of a problem with aid, that the leaders who are the elected leaders, if they are not getting the financial resources through tax revenues from their own population, it is true that then they become less accountable to their own people, because they are accountable more to donors. And this we have a history of seeing this in many poor countries, that instead of listening to their own people, they are busy listening to the donors. So this is a problem which we've seen. But certainly in relation to the Millennium Development Goals, we can give you enough examples where aid which is properly used has contributed significantly to the achievement of the goals. Bangladesh, Nepal, and this part of the world are good examples where things have moved forward, and aid has, I think, overall, where it's been used properly, has been helpful. But as I think we said earlier, you have the Paris Declaration, you have the Accra Agenda of Action. All of these are moments and forums at which donors have made some commitments on how they're going to improve the quality. They'll be more harmonized. They will give enough kind of focus on national priorities, but we still have a long way to go. Some donors are notoriously bad, and once you don't actually follow the national systems and processes, then you are further increasing the risk of corruption and exposing yourself to all sorts of issues. So I think there are big issues in front of us. But for the goals, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major reasons why the goals are we are struggling with the goals in several areas in several countries is because of poor governance, lack of accountability, and corruption.
In the same context, there is something that I have noticed, that it's become a global trend that the local NGOs shift their objectives in accordance to the change in funding policies of the United Nations and donor agencies. Has the UN noticed this act of cleverness and double standard that has led to giving a birth to probably a global intellectual mafia?
I haven't quite thought of them as a mafia, but I mean, in the sense that I can see that fashions and trends do, shift priorities. Now, I mean, overall NGOs are a very small part of the story. I mean, because most of the aid flows government to government. That's where the big issue is. So the big problem we have is where governments themselves are not clear about their priorities. And I mean, you take a country like Rwanda or Mozambique, which are two exceptionally good cases, where the leadership is very clear about what the country's vision is. The people are very clear. They're moving ahead, and they tell the donors, this is what we want to do. And then the donors have to support that process. And the NGOs and other actors, once you have a clearly defined national development plan, which is based on the Millennium Development Goals but adapted to the local and national context, then it's clear, we're all moving in one direction. Where we are not clear ourselves, then we jump. Somebody says jump, then you jump in one direction. Tomorrow you find, today climate change, to yesterday Millennium Development Goals, tomorrow PRSPs, But that's all fine. But what do you want to say as Nepal, Forget about all of these other ideas, So yeah, I mean, there is a problem, but I would say that it's not restricted to NGOs alone.
You have extensively worked in South Asia, and based on the 8% GDP growth of India and China, do you see a rosy picture for South Asia?
No, I think the fruits of the growth, both in India and China, and I think that obviously has had certain impact on the neighboring countries. We've seen the positive fruits and the positive gains. I don't believe that income poverty would have gone down as much as it has in the last decade if we didn't have the kind of growth which we saw. But we have enough experience to show that if you have a high economic growth, it doesn't mean economic growth for poor people. It doesn't translate into improved incomes for poor people. So, which is why in all of these countries, while we've seen reduction in income poverty, we've also seen significant increase in inequality. I mean, you've seen the case of Nepal, the Gini coefficient has significantly gone up, which is an index of growing inequality. And I always give the example of the human body. So if you have a situation where, only your nose is growing or your ear is growing, you would have to go for surgery, So you can't have only one part of the country, the elite in Kathmandu, say, benefiting, or, the cities in India. I mean, you've seen the lifestyle of the rich in India is equivalent to the lifestyle of the richest people in the world. So they're physically in South Asia, but they're equal, they're as good or as bad as anywhere in the world. But you can't sustain this, with the high levels of inequality, and will lead to social tension and conflict. You're sitting on a time bomb. So economic growth, I think, is important, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means, and the end has to be improved lives for all citizens, and particularly since you mentioned South Asia. We have a big problem in South Asia because we have, particularly India and Nepal share a certain religious tradition, etc. And that tradition has ended up keeping society deeply stratified, and the people at the top end of the society have captured most of the benefits. And even in Nepal, you're seeing the tension, now, as those who have been historically excluded for the first time have some voice. And they're raising that voice in a somewhat chaotic way, So because there have not been any avenues to have structured participation, you're like opened, suddenly, as if the box has been opened, and so you're seeing an explosion of voices and historical frustration. So we are hoping that, we've learned from our past, but as we move forward to 2015 to achieve the goals, those goals will be achieved in an equitable way. Because, it's not people from rich households who are dying during childbirth or, suffering. Half of Nepal, for example, is suffering from child malnutrition. Now, those are not from the rich households, from the, upper caste households. These are the, Janjatis, the Dalits, the poorest people, and women. Women are at the bottom of the pile in South Asia. And as a result, all the goals which are related to women are suffering. You can see that. And it's okay, it's very good that we have 1/3 of the women in the Constituent Assembly, but it can't be a token representation by a quota. We're talking about women's empowerment, which has to be comprehensive. So
you're in Nepal at this historic phase. We are writing our constitution after Nepal becoming a republic. What do you suggest that we should not miss out in the new constitution so that we prevent any future conflict from happening, the one like we suffered from for almost a decade?
There are many wise people in the Constituent Assembly, and I think Nepal has got some of the best brains in the world. So, I don't think it's for outsiders to say what needs to be done.
Since you have the experience of working in several conflict countries.
Certainly from our point of view, one of the important things, first of all, I think it's really important that there needs to be a political resolution to the challenges which Nepal is facing today, and the parties have to come together and find a solution to, the current, difficulties that have come up in the last few months. Because, our hope was that once we have a new government in place, the new Constituent Assembly, the new Parliament, the nation can focus now on meeting the needs of the poor and of the masses and, the Millennium Development Goals. But, the time is passing and we're still dealing with all of these political uncertainties. So, either we say that, while we resolve these issues, we still have a very sharp focus on the goals and on the needs of basic rights of people. So in the Constitution, which is the question you asked me, I think, the basic Millennium Development Goal type issues, water, health, education, livelihoods, these should not be, based on the whims and fancies of the elected government at the time. These need to be enshrined in the Constitution as fundamental rights, as has been done in South Africa, as has been done in many other countries. If economic, social, cultural rights are enshrined as fundamental rights, as fundamental as civil and political rights, then you know that this is a constitution which belongs to the majority of the Nepali population, and not just the few people who control the power. Because even though we've seen all these changes, there is a real nervousness that basically it's the same actors. They've now put on new hats and new labels, and we have to go beyond that and take it to the ordinary people, to the poorest citizens in this country.
When we talk of citizen involvement in developing countries, normally it's the youth population that is of higher percentage. How can youths, the next generation, find their role in successful achievement of MDG?
It's very interesting because we've been really thinking hard about this question, and I don't know if you're aware, one of the initiatives we launched 3 years ago was something called Stand Up, and we improved on it. The first year it was called Stand Up, and we had in the first year 23 million people taking part. Second year we called it Stand Up and Speak Out, and last year it was called Stand Up and Take Action. So stand up and take action against poverty, stand up and take action for the Millennium Development Goals. So last year we had 116 million people take part across the world, and most of them are young people. And we tied up with the Guinness Book of World Records to give it a buzz, so we are shattering a world record every year. The largest single social movement on poverty in the history of the Guinness Book of World Records. Mostly young people who want to do something about it. So last year, and it's done over a space of 3 days, in the space of 3 days last year, we had 10 million trees planted by mostly young people in just this part of the world. But it's not just planting trees, but also asking the government, what are you doing about your forestry policy? So this year we'll be doing it from October 16 to 18, because 16th is the World Food Day, 17th is the World Poverty Day. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I hope that your viewers will join us in big numbers. So that's one part. But the second part which we're thinking of really is about having youth MDG monitors at the community level, whether it's a village or a slum, where people can locally monitor to what extent these services which are supposed to be reaching them are actually reaching them. So there's a strong potential for young people to become local MDG monitors, and we are working on this, and we'll announce something about this shortly.
Has there been any initiative of putting this into the curriculum of schools and colleges?
Oh yeah. In many places, where, again, it depends on the government, where the government is serious about it. In many countries, they have included it in the curriculum as well. But, the curriculum part, etc., will increase awareness on these goals. But for us, it's not just awareness, but people who take action.
Nepal is rich in its natural resources and water, and also holds great prospects for tourism and agriculture. Yet poverty is very distinct in Nepal. In your opinion, what could be that one thing with which Nepal can alleviate from its poverty level?
Well, Nepal is, I've always been quite amazed that in spite of the conflict and civil war, etc., we've seen over the last decade, it's done reasonably well on the Millennium Development Goals, and according to official figures, Nepal is on target to achieving several of the goals, including the income goals, many of the health goals, and with some additional effort, they can also achieve the education goal, and so we are actually on track on many of the goals. One area where they're facing very big challenges are on hunger and child malnutrition, where Nepal has very high rates of child malnutrition. And I think also in the case of women's rights, I think there's a lot more to be done in the case of Nepal. Now, in terms of the magic bullet which you're looking for, which is going to change everything, I think the magic bullet really is how government can work with people. Because we have although we have a new government, new people there, etc., the gap, the distance between citizens and the state is still far too much. So we have to find a way of bridging that gap. And one concrete way in which I was talking about earlier is to find a way of tracking delivery on the ground. And I think you will really get the truth from citizens who are the ones who are depending on these services.
Sooner or later, global water crisis will be a serious issue that the world will have to deal with. For someone who has dealt with climate change issues, now you're dealing with global food crisis. How prepared are you to deal with this upcoming global water crisis?
Well, I think the global water crisis is not something of the future. We are already having to deal with it. And, I don't separate these crises, as I said earlier. To me, the water crisis is very closely linked to the climate and environmental crisis. We don't even talk about climate, we talk about environment. And the reason why we're in this situation is, because we take these things for granted. We assume that this is an unlimited natural resource. Now, that's not the case. We know that very well. And we have to find ways of managing both our land and water resources in an integrated manner. And I think Nepal and South Asia, we have a lot of work to do in this regard. And in fact, a lot of these problems cross national boundaries. As you know, we have a very integrated, interlinked ecosystem in South Asia, and some of the resolution for this problem will have to be found across national barriers. And particularly, you know very well the Kosi River situation, which goes across two countries. If you take the Ganges water situation between Bangladesh and India, we have the same situation. We can't deal with it looking at narrow national boundaries. So, and this is linked. If you connect this with the rate at which ice caps are melting, and the way the Himalayas are being made much more vulnerable with climate change, If we take a narrow approach, we're not going to find solutions. So we have to take an integrated approach which cuts across national barriers. And the second piece, we go back to what I said earlier. The solution for dealing with improved land and water management is not by having a fantastic plan created by the best scientists in South Asia. We need that, but ultimately it's the people who are going to implement these plans. So if you're not involving the people who are living in these places from the beginning, if they don't feel a part of the achievement of this plan, just like if they don't feel a part of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, the goals will never be achieved. So we need, once again, multi-stakeholder. I'm a bit nervous to use these words because they've been abused so much, multi-stakeholder, partnership, etc. But we need a collective solution to a collective problem.
Let us hope that the United Nations is successful in dealing with and in solving all these global issues that we discussed. With this hope, I wish you good luck and goodbye. See you next week, the same time. Thank you for being with us.